So yes, people, welcome back to the channel, and a little bit of a bombshell hit the timeline yesterday. Transfer news, Manchester United, it's that time of year and you know how it gets. And it makes sense because this is one of the most anticipated transfer windows that United have had in a long time. I do feel like that's been said a few times, but this one does feel very, very eagerly anticipated. And that isn't necessarily about excitement. It's about nervousness. It's about skepticism. It's about caution, as well as obviously a glimmer of excitement, because many believe, including myself, that a really strong transfer window could put United in a little bit of an intriguing place in terms of what they can compete in. And I feel like that could be silverware, with it be a cup, domestic cup. I believe United could be in and around it for the Premier League title. Not exactly winning it, but closer, much closer to Manchester City and much closer to Arsenal than we have been. And it's important that United obviously capitalise on the transfer window and the market, because Liverpool and Chelsea have had a bit of a fall-off season, and I do not believe Liverpool and Chelsea will be as bad next season. So that will be another team that we have to deal with. So United need to make sure that we aren't just looking ahead, but we're also looking behind us. And I've said this time and time again, United don't obviously operate in a vacuum. We'll have to be keeping a close eye on the transfer doings of our rival teams, but United need to make sure that they're moving forward in the right direction, because if other clubs do and we stay still or we plateau, then we can end up falling behind. So, the news that hit the sound waves, it's not even the sound waves anymore. That's not how you find news. It's the timeline on Twitter. Is obviously Sully Talks, probably the best ITK in the business for transfer news, injury news, anything surrounding Manchester United, reported that the interest with Ederson is very real, because this has been something that's been peddled by all the Italian outlets for well over a week now. A lot of the fan base have felt underwhelmed by it, so they've dismissed it, saying it's very agent-driven. I still think there is an element of it that is a bit agent-driven, but the interest from Manchester United's side, and particularly Wilcox, seems as though it is very real. And this is what was reported by Sully Talks last night. That caused a little bit of a stir, because Sully Talks coming out with it then made it feel very real to the fan base. So then now we've got to discuss it, because it does seem like a transfer dealing that might be actually plausible and might be someone that we see come through the door in the summer. And it isn't necessarily one of the big names that we've been speaking about previously. So let me get into the report. This is what Sully Talks has reported. So the report says Manchester United have had talks with Ederson's representatives via intermediaries in recent weeks. The 26-year-old is admired highly by Jason Wilcox, with interest ongoing for years. His agent Andre Curry is pushing for a move. Nothing done, but interest is real, seen as an opportunity. And he is also quoted Matteo Moretto, which is one of the Italian outlets that have been pretty much putting out daily updates of linking Ederson to Manchester United. This was someone that has been linked with us in the last couple of transfer windows. So I did say in the last video that there probably was a little bit of fire because of the amount of smoke that there has been and the links. And Jason Wilcox being a driver of it. Jason Wilcox was apparently someone that was massive behind the Ugarte signing. And some of the Jason Wilcox driven links since he's arrived, I'm going to actually give you a bit of a list now, does cause for concern. Because the list that he has had doesn't really fill you with the most amount of confidence, especially with someone that is United sporting director and is tasked with something that has a fair amount of responsibility in terms of the club size, the club aspiration and the club direction. So the list that Jason Wilcox has been massively behind in terms of recruitment since he's been is as follows. So Wilcox reported interests have been the likes of Semenyo, Ugarte, Delap, Ederson, Tolson, Stiller and Lewis Hall. So obviously, if you go through that list, Semenyo has been decent output-wise at City, but he's not been largely liked by the City fan base due to obviously not him being a 1v1 threat and his technical ability and his base technical ability not really being of the level of City attackers and City players that they're used to, and within the squad itself. So his output has dried up as of late, and he does seem to be a player that is probably just below the level of a Manchester City. Obviously, Ugarte, less said about him, the better. The lap has been a travesty at Chelsea. You've got obviously Ederson, who we've been linked to, who is a little bit of an underwhelming signing, but we'll obviously go a little bit more in depth into him. Tosin, who hasn't really pulled up any trees at Chelsea himself. Stiller, who is a technical footballer in Bundesliga, but isn't really anywhere near up the list. I know some people do have a liking to him. I haven't really watched too much of him. I think I've actually watched one game of him. I thought it's decent, tidy, but I'm not sure about the translation physically to the Premier League, which unfortunately is something that you have to account for. And then Lewis Hall is the other one. Lewis Hall is a top player. I think that one, in fairness, is someone that I would love at Manchester United. I think Lewis Hall is one of the only left-backs on the market. I think if United signed, it lessens the pressure on you getting an out-and-out left winger, because I feel like he's a type of marauding left-back where you can coexist with the likes of Acuna out there, who likes to operate a little bit more in field. So you actually have a little bit of balance on that side. But anyway, Ederson. A lot of people have likened him to Ugarte. He's nothing like Ugarte. He's a much better footballer and a much better player than Ugarte, in my opinion. More technical than him. Has more strings to his bow than him. I think he's actually physically better as well. He'd be an upgrade on Ugarte in a sense, but with United only having one midfielder going into next season, really, which will be Kobe Mainoo, United and us as fans know we need at least 3 or 4 midfielders walking through the door. And we need to cover a lot of different abilities, attributes and profiles and get like the right composition with the players that we sign. It's not always just about getting the 3 big names. I have said that. It's about getting 3 players that cover different skills and different attributes that are needed within the midfield area, so that you've got the most balance with no matter which players obviously you start together in a midfield 3 or a double pivot, etc. Obviously with Bruno probably being one of the 10s. And giving you that little bit of flexibility in there for different games, different opposition and different game states. I think that's incredibly important, especially when you're operating in 4 different, obviously, competitions. And it makes you a little bit more difficult to prepare for, because you've obviously got adaptability. That it allows you adaptability game to game, but within games in itself. And obviously makes United a lot more complete as a team in general, in the engine room, which is very important. So I've spoke about it before, how you have like almost like 2 way of categorizing midfielders. Is obviously it's not exactly binary, but you've got generalists and you've got specialists. You've got specialists that are players that are almost like upper world class or specialise in one particular type of midfield player, whether that be obviously a deep liar, whether that be in like a bit of a box crasher or so on and so forth. I am simplifying it. And you got a generalist that isn't more of a jack of all trades but doesn't specialise in a necessary attribute. And generalists obviously work because, and obviously are quite heavily favoured in a sense, because sometimes you can get them where they're almost like a jack of all trades, but they are very, very good in a couple of them. And that will be obviously more favourable than a player that specialises incredibly well in one particular trait, but is below average in the rest. Obviously, see how it works. It is quite complex, obviously a lot of moving parts, but Ederson does feel like a player that is well-rounded in a sense, but he's just decent at most things, where he's not really massively above average in anything. So he's a solid player, he's decent, but for the cost, which will be around 40 million, would he be value for money? You could possibly argue. I don't think he's necessarily anywhere near as bad as people have made out. I have watched him a handful of times, obviously at Atalanta when they were doing well, like a couple of years ago under Gasperini. They're a very exciting team to watch. He's not been quite as good since obviously the manager's left. And the past couple of years, they've not really been doing as well as a team. And sometimes there's a bit of a concern about Serie A translation to the Premier League, because it's not quite as physical. It's obviously much slower paced. Those are a couple of things that Ederson has as a USP, which he is physically good, can get about the pitch, but you don't know whether his ability to kind of impose himself physically in the Serie A will be the same when he has to try and impose himself in the Premier League. Obviously, you get less time on the ball. Does that put more pressure on Ernest on his technical skill and his ability than he might show there? There's a lot of difficulties when you're obviously thinking about recruitment, and that's why we don't get paid the big bucks, and the people that actually know that are getting paid the big bucks, the likes of obviously Vivell and the Wilcox and the recruitment department and the scouting team that have more resources than we do, that are obviously watching a lot more game tape than we do, should know better. Well, obviously the uproar has mostly been there are a number of midfielders that you'd obviously have ahead of him. The argument then for him is Ederson as a third or fourth signing and as a rotational piece isn't exactly the worst. I do kind of see that because I feel like he's a decent player. But I think for that role as a third and fourth midfielder, when you do sign two marquee ones, when you're talking about the Chouamainis and the Belabes and the Andersons and the Tenalis, the Mateus Fernandezes that are obviously would be seen as the marquee signings when you obviously sign two of them, and then obviously Ederson being like a rounded out one with a bit budget option, which will be around 40 million. It's not the worst, I guess, but I feel like for that signing, there are players in Europe that are probably even better value for money, that are probably around the same age, probably even younger, especially in Ligue 1. Obviously, you've heard people talk about him. Obviously, people have talked about Manzibi, and I think that's how you say his name, the player that's obviously been doing extremely well for Freiburg, and he's a youngster, obviously very young. You've got the likes of like Jiri Cisse and Patrick Zabi. Obviously, I'm always talking about these League on youngsters because I think they've become that league has become a hotbed for talent, and it probably feels like the easiest physical translation between the leagues because Premier League extremely physical, League One is similar, and the translation, especially in that area, can actually bode well, which is ironic because Ugarte did come from that league and it hasn't boded well, but I feel like he's a little bit of an anomaly, and he didn't exactly cut it in Ligue 1. He went to PSG, obviously flopped for a year and then got shipped, so he doesn't really count. You got Mamadou Sangare, who's another option that people have spoken about as well. You got Lamine Camara from Monaco. You got players that are probably within the same ballpark, or probably even better in a sense, than an Ederson. But these players might actually probably have a higher ceiling than Ederson in its sense, but will cost around the same amount. And they'll also cost less wages. You have more of a fail-safe if it doesn't work out for them because of their age and profile. If they don't work out in a couple of years, their resale value will be much more. And these are things that you obviously as a club you have to think about. I know people don't like talking about the finances and so on and so forth. And obviously probably I'm talking from a place of skepticism and probably from a place of being a little bit pessimistic, which, as you know, is a little bit more natural for me. But I feel like the boom potential is a little bit higher for sometimes those players being like the third or fourth signing rather than signing Ederson, who, I know he's 26, he's not exactly old, but he'll be turning 27 in July, so he'll be 27 by the time we go into next season. Then he has 2 years, which is what Ineos have been saying is the time that new signers will get to obviously make an impression. Then he'll be turning 29. You've signed him for 40 million. His wages will also be higher than these players probably than you'd sign than the ones I've just mentioned. And then you're going to take probably a significant loss. And will be a little bit more difficult to move probably. I know that is obviously the flip side of it is Ederson comes in and ends up being a really, really good squad player and then you don't matter. But you obviously have to account for the worst possibility whilst also accounting for the most upside. And I think there are players that you could probably get for around the same amount as Ederson, maybe even cheaper, a little bit younger, that can also fill that role that he'd fill, which is as a squad piece and as a rotational player, that could actually boom higher ceiling-wise, but also offer you potential resale if they don't make the grade in a couple of years. So that is pretty much my stance on it. Is that United do need squad depth, and squad depth was something that reared its ugly head again yesterday. I saw a piece from Simon Stone that showed that United have rotated the team in the starting 11 or whatever it is, like an extremely low amount, which means that United, and that's with one game a week, obviously affects that in a sense, obviously makes it a little bit more reasonable and conducive, but also, as we've watched United week in, week out, we know that the players that are on the bench, that come in, that rotate, there's a bit of a massive fall off from the starters. And that puts a lot of pressure and a lot of physical pressure on the starting 11. Obviously, a lot of minutes in the legs, and makes it a little bit more difficult to make confident changes within games where things need to be changed or things need to be adjusted. You've got players like Ugarte that when he comes on, it feels like United fall to pieces. We've spoken about FB ref and the plus minuses of like when players are on and off the pitch. And it feels like United look to the bench and there's not really anyone that you can turn to change the game or to see a game out. Or just a player that you could probably start or like one game and not feel like nervous about the fact they've had to come into the fold. And that's going to be even more important next season when we're competing in the Champions League. So it obviously is important. And another thing that people are obviously concerned about is it seems like a deal that United are going to sees a market opportunity probably for the price and he's standing, and they're going to jump at the chance early doors because it seems like the link that is the strongest at the moment. That obviously will piss United fans off because you feel like that is a signing that you do later in the window and you should be targeting the marquee signings, the Tchouaméni and Anderson, Tonali, Baleba and Mateus Fernandes. You should be targeting those first. Getting one or two of those throughout the door and then an Ederson at the back end of it. If you go into the window and obviously go for the easiest option first and Ederson comes first through the door, it then feels that sense of a little bit underwhelming because, and also I think United then put a lot of pressure on themselves to make sure that they follow up with the marquee signings after it, whilst also knowing that you have used some of your budget already. So you're almost doing it backwards. And that's just obviously optics, and that's obviously probably transfer leverage as well. So I think a lot of the things that I've mentioned probably make the deal look a little bit meh. And that's probably the best way to put it. But I also don't think he's an awful signing. And I feel like he's someone that if he came in as a third or fourth signing, he'll be better than Ugarte. But can United do better for a similar price for the same squad position? And that's where I think yes. Do you think this is a little bit of a red flag, by the way? I think Ederson only has 3 Brazil caps. I think João Gomez is around 10, which is more. And obviously I did a comparison between them two. But the last time Ederson's been picked for a Brazil squad was last year, March in 2025. And since then, he hasn't been picked for the Brazil team. And I'm going to list you the midfielders that have been picked in the Brazil squad since Ederson was last picked. And I want you to tell me whether you think this is a little bit of a red flag. So, the midfielders called up to the Brazil squad since Ederson was last called up are Bruno Guimarães, Casemiro, André Santos, Andreas Pereira, Fabinho, Gabriel Sara, Danilo from Botafogo, Lucas Paqueta and Ederson. Is that a red flag, is the question. And a lot of you would probably say yes. But obviously there are a lot of political things and a lot of concerns. Obviously there are many great players that weren't favourable for international call-ups, and that's sometimes just due to the manager in charge, profile of player, tough competition within your position, within the national team. Brazil haven't exactly had a golden era in terms of the midfield position. And if you look at those names and you're thinking Ederson can't really make his way in there, I still think that does work a little bit as a red flag more than most. Some people might disagree. There might be some caveats. But I think it's just something to think about. What I don't prescribe to is him being a bum and an awful player. I have watched him only a handful of times. I haven't watched him in a long time. It was when Atalanta were doing well in the Champions League. I've seen a few games where he's playing, and I thought a couple of the games he was fairly decent. You can see he's serviceable. But I'm not going to act like I'm an expert. I can only go off what I have seen. I haven't seen him in quite a while. But people that I do trust have said he's not played quite as well, since obviously that could be due to the fact that Atalanta fell off. But he just did strike me, as I've mentioned it. He felt like, Bruno Guimaraes seems to be his like player comp stylistically, but he's a much inferior version, is what I thought when I did watch him. But he wasn't exactly someone that stood out. I was like, oh, United definitely need to sign him. But he is someone that when I did watch, if he was asking me, could he play for United, I thought he could be a squad option, could be a rotational piece, could be serviceable. But is that the type of player United need to prioritise early in a window? That's the question. But anyway, that is what I've got to say on the Ederson deal. Obviously, it's news that struck. I thought I'd give my little 2 pence on it. We'll have to see how it materialises, whether the links actually lead to something strong. But the links have been long-standing. It does seem to be very serious. Obviously, his agent does seem to be pushing it quite heavily, but the interest is real. So let me know what you think in the comments. Ederson in, Ederson out. Are you pissed off at the fact that he's been linked to us? Is he someone that you can stomach as being the third or fourth midfield signing, or is it just someone that you don't want anywhere in the club? But anyway, let me know. Personally, I obviously prefer João Gomez. Atletico Madrid have been linked to Ederson and João Gomez, and it seems like they are pivoting towards João Gomez, who I'd actually prefer. That is another concern of mine. But yeah, that's actually my balanced view on things. But anyway, thanks for the support. Remember to like, comment, subscribe, hit the hype button, and I will see you next time.